Hello, good morning and welcome to the Sunday Politics here in the West. Coming up, no bed for the night. Councils had to offer more help to the homeless this week after a cold snap. But is the government really doing enough to help those with nowhere to go? Well, joining me to discuss that and much more besides are my guests. Jo Harris is a Lib Dem councillor on Gloucestershire County Council, and Kerry-Anne Mendoza runs The Canary, which is a website based in Bristol which broadly supports Jeremy Corbyn. Welcome to you both. We had been hoping to be joined by Tim Montgomery, the Conservative commentator, but he sent his apologies right at the last moment because he's not very well. So we hope that you get well, Tim, soon, and thank you, Jo, for coming in. Now, first, the government's Brexit figures were made public this week. MPs got to see the Treasury's own analysis of the effects Brexit might have on the South West's economy. In every scenario, we become poorer than we would have been. Well, Kerry-Anne, you are a Remainer, so presumably you're not particularly surprised by these figures.
No, not surprised at all. It's the reason that I voted against Brexit and to remain in the European Union. You know, I think this is becoming ever clearer, the picture of just the dangers represented by Brexit, and I certainly would hope that by the time that sort of exit comes about, we would hopefully have a different government in place and hopefully take a different step.
Do you think Jeremy Corbyn should change his mind on Brexit and say, look, no, we'll back a second referendum?
Yes, certainly. I mean, we've written editorials about Corbyn's position on the European Union. I respect the fact that he's sticking to his guns. I'm all for conviction politicians. It's just on this issue we feel slightly differently. I think what I would like to see, we're all talking about the wonders of democratic engagement. What I would certainly like to see is a second referendum when we're clear on the deal, because all we've had is a referendum on what. Okay. I want a referendum on how. Which
happens to be the Lib Dem position, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and I think if you're in the West Country and you want that to happen, I'd suggest voting Liberal Democrat. These figures aren't a surprise at all, really. We've been told this for a very long time, ever since the referendum campaign. So I think people do need to be given the option to think again on this issue, and they should be offered an exit from Brexit if they want that.
Jo, in most parts of the West, your place included, I think, it was a vote to leave.
No, in the Cotswolds it was a vote to remain, and we now have a situation where our MP, who was a leaver, is now backing an extreme hard Brexit, has joined Jacob Rees-Mogg's group to try and make that happen. So, I think we're going to talk later about young people in politics. It's things like that that are, really great on young people.
OK, well, we are, yeah, because one of the effects of the last general election is that both main parties now think the youth vote is crucial. The Tories have appointed new party chairs to boost their appeal to the young, and Labour have stepped up their efforts to get young people campaigning. James Craig reports.
There's heated debate, but it doesn't get much more heated than this.
I thought it would be more interesting to debate with them rather than to stand down at the front and try and bellow away and cover the noise. Political debate is interesting and is exciting, and I'm always willing to engage in political debate. They're British. They weren't going to do me any harm. They disagree with me. They disapprove of everything I stand for, but they're good, honest British citizens. They weren't going to hit me.
I'm going to tell you why I am a Conservative, why you should be a Conservative.
He was at the university because he's a big draw for younger supporters, which his party desperately needs, like these members of the University of the West of England's Conservative Society.
And if students or even young people speak up, then the government will listen. It happened with rent. Obviously, they've got rid of the rent charge.
We're very, very much in favour of the government's new reform to cap student fees, to lower the increase of payment amount to $25,000, the threshold. That's an important reform. Also, Gove's environmental reforms are very, very popular here.
They even come dressed to impress.
Reagan was a kind of great friend and ally of Margaret Thatcher, and Margaret Thatcher is kind of seen as our great Conservative leader and first female Prime Minister in the UK.
That was decades ago, though. Couldn't you have found something more recent, not a Cameron, not a Theresa May hoodie?
Well, if they had some online, then sure, I'd get a Cameron or May hoodie.
But despite the enthusiasm here, the party knows it has more to do to attract the youth vote. It's this MP's new job to get that message across.
There's a couple of aspects to it, I think. One is a policy agenda in terms of, are we listening and are we delivering on the things that matter the most to younger people. I think that's not just teenagers and students that will be the stereotype, but I think working families and younger working people as well. And then the other side is us as a party. How do we re-engage and how do we rebuild that activist base that has been there in the past and has been really successful?
Here he is, Jeremy Corbyn.
But for Labour, is it a case of preaching to the converted?
If we come together to understand the power we've got.
Jeremy Corbyn had thousands of supporters at last year's Glastonbury, and he's got some in Bruton too. Hal isn't even old enough to vote yet, but he's already out campaigning for Labour.
Turnout was very high in this constituency. Turnout can be higher, and what we want to work on is having as many people who perhaps have been alienated with politics for too long to register to vote, and that's the kind of people we need to reach out to.
Although some people on the doorstep are bringing up familiar questions about Labour policy.
As far as I'm concerned, I would be looking for a party that was pro-Europe.
Yeah. And though some of them aren't old enough to drink, meeting in the pub afterwards, they're pleased with their efforts.
I think it is very important, not because of the amount of us, but also because of our energy and our willingness and enthusiasm to go out and talk to other people. And I think that was particularly palpable with the Labour Party's general election campaign, with these enthusiastic young members being the foot soldiers and talking to local people.
A recent study found no evidence of significantly higher turnout among the young, but support for Labour was greater among younger voters. For both parties, winning over people like Hal and his friends could be vital in getting the keys to number 10.
OK, let's pick up a few issues there. Let's start at the beginning of that film and those scuffles we saw with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Do you think that there is any excuse for anyone to turn up to a political meeting wearing a mask?
I actually think, to be honest, young people can't really win today. We spend most of our time criticising them as these passive, unengaged people who only seem to care about the latest Snapchat filter. And then when these young people come out and make a stand, Jacob Rees-Mogg is not your friend. This is a man, they call him the member for the mid-19th century, and that's not a compliment. This is a man who is against abortion, even in cases of rape. This is a man who voted twice to make my marriage illegal. He's not a great chap.
He's got the right to speak.
He has every much the right to speak, as they have the right to stand up and defy him. And what I think is great about what those young people did is they turned out that evening to say, we own our future, not you, Jacob Rees-Mogg. And I'd just make the other point, they did not bring the violence. When those people stood up in a non-violent protest, a Jacob Rees-Mogg supporter...
No, we don't know, because the police will be looking into what happened.
But it's really important that people know...
No, we won't. There's a police investigation going on.
Instigate this violence, and we must make that point really clear.
They didn't instigate the violence, but we saw from the pictures they turned up with masks on. Why would you do that?
Because in the world that we live in, every camera that's taking a picture of those young people, the next time they go for a job, the whole media's covered this.
But if you wanted to turn up for a political debate, why would you wear a mask?
And bad and wrong. And if people choose to protect their identity because they don't want their names dragged through the papers, as has been done...
But if you don't do anything wrong, you won't want to get your name in the paper if you just turn up at a political debate, are you?
That young girl that was struck twice in the face by a Jacob Rees-Mogg supporter, who is a martial arts instructor... Her face was all over the paper the next day. I think she has the right to withhold her identity if she wants to.
All right. Now, you started in politics young. Just tell us about your beginning.
Yeah, well, I was... it was 7 years ago now, back in 2011 in the local elections, and I was approached by the local Lib Dems. They'd read about me in the local paper because I've been a victim of crime, and I didn't think the response to crime, to my attack was particularly good. So they saw my call to try and expand CCTV, and they ran with it, and they gave me the opportunity. And yeah, in 2011 I was elected the youngest councillor, or one of the youngest councillors in the UK. 2 years later, the youngest mayor in the UK. So it's been quite a whirlwind.
So how old were you when you were mayor of Cirencester?
So I was 20 years old when I was mayor of Cirencester, and I think I was probably the youngest mayor in UK history. I stand to be corrected, but I can't find anybody younger. I think since then it has been surpassed, but for that period of time I was the youngest mayor.
Are there any passionate young Lib Dems
Yes, I meet lots of them, and I have to say they're not concentrated. And I think the problem where I live in the Cotswolds is that there aren't a lot of young people around because they can't afford to live there. The opportunities aren't there for them. So I think if we're going to try and get more young people engaged, we seriously need to look at the offer of rural places in particular, because lots of young people are fleeing rural areas, and it's unfortunate.
We were told during last year's election that Jeremy Corbyn energised the younger generation. Now it turns out from the research that he didn't particularly.
Oh, he absolutely did. I mean, you can see that. Name me the last politician that had a standing ovation at Glastonbury. Name me the last population that got young people out on the streets, singing Jeremy Corbyn or even singing their name. It just doesn't happen. Politics has been seen as really something done to young people, not something done by young people for far too long. And what's hugely exciting, I think, now is to see young people really engaging and saying, you know what, this is our future too. House prices...
I think he's got to be careful, though, because the biggest issue that young people care about is remaining in the European Union. That's clear from all the polling that's done. And I think, well, it's great. I think, the passion that Jeremy Corbyn's installed into young people is great. He's got to be careful that if he does get into government, he doesn't let young people down on that. Otherwise, he'll just be another politician.
Actually, part of the reason that young people feel so passionately about Remain is about the impact that they believe Brexit will have, and that is the lack of housing, the lack of jobs. And these are real now. These aren't things that could have, should have, would have happened in 2 years.
The turnout wasn't that high, was it?
Right now.
But let me just go back to the election result. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn, before the election, was offering students effectively, £27,000. He said, you will not pay your £9,000 a year bill to go to university from this September. And yet still he didn't win the election, even with giveaways like that.
I think it was remarkable that he managed to score the biggest swing to Labour in history. I mean, given that there was almost universal opposition to him in the press, across national broadcasters, this guy was up against it, even from people in his own party. And to be able to actually break through all of that and still reach people was extraordinary.
Well, the danger is, if he, the leader of the opposition, you'd expect at this stage in a parliament, with a government as incompetent as they clearly are, you'd expect him to be 10, 15 points ahead in the polls, and that's not happening. I think if he if he got a grip on his party's policy on Europe, I think he'd probably be there. But that's what we'll see.
But the Lib Dems have got a grip on their policy in Europe, and they're nowhere to be seen in the polls.
Well, no, you're right, but I think there are many reasons for that.
How did that last election go?
Well, it didn't go too well, and there is a recovery job to do, and it will be a generational thing.
All right, a generational thing?
I think so.
OK, interesting. Now, the cold weather makes the plight of the homeless starker than ever. The numbers sleeping rough have risen every year since official counts began. That was only in 2010, actually. The latest figures show it's not just bad in cities. Per head of population, the West's highest rate is now the town of Swindon. So can new legislation turn things around? Here's Paul Baltrop.
You get nights where people come and they give you insults, going, "Oh, get a job. Oh, you deserve to be homeless. Look at the state of you."
A lot of days you end up just led down to sleep all day because you can't get out of your sleeping bag, it's so cold.
People judge you, people just... I've noticed, I know you're on the streets, but people throw things and it's just disrespectful.
Cold, freezing, proper freezing, like.
In one of the world's wealthiest countries, thousands are struggling to keep warm out on the streets every night. It's not just that the number found sleeping rough has risen every year since official counts started in 2010. It's now 300 in the West, with the biggest number in Bristol. However, it's risen fast in some surprising places. Both the city and Bath and North East Somerset recorded 4.4 rough sleepers per 10,000 households. They're just behind Taunton Deane with 4.6, but the region's highest rate is now Swindon, which found 4.8 rough sleepers per 10,000 households. Charities and volunteers try to help. This night shelter scheme is among recent initiatives by churches in Bristol, alarmed by the crisis on their doorstep.
I am taken aback by the number of people I see, sleeping in porches, in doorways, sleeping in the doorways of the cathedral. I think there's a moral imperative in that it's not acceptable for there to be huge gaps between rich and poor. I think it's a mark of any society how it responds to the poorest in its midst.
It troubles politicians too. A committee of MPs from all parties was blunt in its advice to government.
You need to stop being complacent about this. It is not enough also to just throw money at it. It needs to be money that is fixing the core root of the problem, that looks at why people are homeless in the first place. Critically, you need to be building more houses, yes, but they need to be truly affordable houses.
The government have acted. In April, the Homelessness Reduction Act comes into effect. Among other changes, it means new duties for local authorities to do prevention and relief work, and doubling from 4 to 8 weeks the period when someone at risk of becoming homeless must be helped.
The Homelessness Reduction Act means that councils will have a duty to try and help people before they actually become homeless, and that is why, as part of the suite of efforts, we're looking into dealing with this, and we are confident that by 2022 we will halve us sleeping in this country.
Charities with decades of experience working out on the streets think it'll help a bit.
It will depend a lot on how local authorities go ahead and plan and put in place teams to deliver the Act, but it's a really, really important step forward. Money's tight and services are being cut, but what can be a higher priority than a vulnerable individual in a doorway on our high street?
But all experts agree homelessness cannot be conquered without much more affordable housing.
And as Paul said, it seems particularly awful in this cold weather. Well, let's just talk about some of the issues there. Joe, the responsibility seems to be being passed down now by the government to local authorities. Are they in a position to deal with it?
Oh, I say absolutely not. We just don't have the funding available to deal with this, this crisis, and that's what it is. It is a crisis. One of the things that we could start looking at is bringing empty homes into use. In Cotswold alone, there are 296. I think there are in the region of 700 or 800 in Gloucester. So that's one thing you could do to try and end rough sleeping.
These properties?
Multiple, some of them are council homes, some of those are private rented, but councils do have some powers in order to bring empty dwellings into use, and many councils aren't using those powers at present. But any legislation that comes forward, it must be supplemented with funding, otherwise it's not going to happen.
But if there was a nice Cotswold cottage available and empty, and it belonged to somebody at a holiday home, can the local authority take it and use it?
Well, they can. First of all, they can levy.
You want them to?
Yeah, yes, I think so. If there are people sleeping rough on the streets and it's sat there empty for 11, 12 months of the year, then absolutely, they should either be charged a lot of council tax as it's being empty, or if it's longer still, it's just not being occupied or used, then yes, there should be ways that you can bring that into use.
Kerry-Anne, I'm very interested in your take on this. I mean, is the root cause, is it poverty or is it actually a mental health issue at its root? People sleeping rough on the streets?
Well, what we're seeing now really are kind of the results of 30 years of having no movement on a housing crisis, on the fact that ideological austerity has meant that we've withdrawn funding from the types of mental health support, from the alcohol and drug addiction support that we would have seen 10 years ago and beyond, and all of these issues have, not to mention skyrocketing rents and all that kind of stuff, and the cuts to welfare that have seen people, 3,000% almost rise in food bank use. All of these issues have come together to create the problem that we literally see now with our own eyes on the streets. And what's really concerned me over the last couple of years is that rather than seeing a genuine commitment by the government to reverse these policies, to say, look, we've clearly cut too far. We've got 134% rise in rough sleepers, to nearly 3,000% rise in food
They are
bags.
committed to halving it by 2022.
Words are great, actions are better. What we've actually seen is anti-homeless spikes.
In Gloucester, yeah.
But they're putting millions more into it.
We even had a tanning salon in Bristol that put a sprinkler system in the roof just outside the front doors, which would literally, quote, make it rain on homeless people.
That was a private owner who was worried about 8 or 9 people sleeping outside.
But again, what's driving that behaviour is the people running that salon had no faith that the homelessness crisis would be reduced. They went from having one homeless person sat outside to 9 homeless people.
We have a Labour council in Bristol now. That salon was in Bristol. Should they be doing more?
We have to do more. We absolutely have to. Part of the problem, as Joe has pointed out, is that local authorities are essentially being treated like I mean, they're basically human shields for governmental decisions in Westminster.
Exactly. If I can
because
say,
if they take all the money away and then complain that the local authorities aren't doing anything, it's deeply unfair on local authorities.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think actually a lot of the councils are good at tackling homelessness. The problem is it's the mental health support isn't there to supplement people when they found them a new property, so they aren't able to cope.
Thank you. Well, let's take a look at the rest of the week's political news in just 60 seconds. Here's our Martin.
1,000 people marched through Bristol this week to celebrate the first women being given the right to vote. They were there to commemorate the centenary and highlight how much more needs to be done. South West Wiltshire MP Andrew Murison asked the PM to think again about possible cuts to the Royal Marines.
Does the Prime Minister agree with me that reducing them further at this stage would be inconsistent with this government's strong record on defence and security?
Theresa May said reports of cuts were speculative. The PM was also asked questions by representatives of Honda, which employs thousands in Swindon. Like everyone else, the car maker wants to know what's going to happen after Brexit. And who's been pinching these? Hundreds of black wheelie bins have gone missing in Bristol. Replacing them costs the council £20 each. A waste of money.
With another week that is flashed past. As the are you the editor of the Canary? Is that you're the editor-in-chief? Okay. What do you think of the government's plans to try and regenerate the printed press? Is that something that can be done now, or has the tide actually turned?
I don't think the government should have any role whatsoever in the press. I think it's really important that there's a big gap between the state and a free and independent media. I think there are lots of things that we did on paper, 10, 15, 20 years ago that we no longer do on paper.
So all those jobs going in the local media, that doesn't...
No, I think jobs are moving. I think those are separate issues. Jobs are moving. I think the issues with business model crisis in journalism, how do we pay for it, how do we maintain it, sustain? We're part of the future. I think the future overall, I think, is positive, but I think we're in for a very tough maybe 10, 15 years as we transition to that.
Joe?
We've got several local newspapers in Gloucestershire, and they're all changing the way they operate. The Wilts and Gloucester Standard, which is a fantastic newspaper in the Cotswolds, they're having, they've just relocated to Stroud, and actually, it was only a few weeks ago, I've already noticed, there's a lack of proactivity, and it's concerning because, local press are often the sort of bastion of democratic accountability, and I think we're losing that, and I think it's regrettable.
Yeah, and they work very hard, I can tell you that for nothing. And that's all from us this week. My thanks to my guests, Kerry-Anne Mendoza and Joe Harris. Now, don't forget you can follow us on Twitter for the latest updates, and you can watch the show back again on the iPlayer. But now let's return to London and Sarah.